Mild Vertigo by Mieko Kanai was translated by Polly Barton from the Japanese into English and was published by Fitzcarraldo Editions. There's not much point in me holding this up because Fitzcarraldo aren't very considerate with their review copies. It's just blank. Mild Vertigo is a really short novel that was originally written and published in the late 90s, and now, thanks to Polly Barton's incredible translation, we have it available to us in English. And since I've mentioned it, let's talk about the translation first. Polly Barton is an amazing writer and translator. Fitzcarraldo themselves actually published her really experimental, strange, and kind of daring memoir, 50 Sounds, which talked about her experiences living in Japan and learning the Japanese language, and just how obsessively fascinated she became with how Japanese works as a language. She's translated some really, really great stuff, some of my favourite Japanese novels, and Mild Vertigo is another absolute win from her. It's a pretty, intense, hefty piece of literary Japanese fiction, and translating it must have taken a lot of effort in spite of how short it is. And that's the next thing to mention. This is a tiny little thing, about 150 pages, but it takes time and real focus and attention to read it, in spite of the fact that it's so simple. Mild Vertigo tells the story of a housewife. Her name is Natsume. She's married to a man and they have 2 sons. They live in a very pleasant suburb of Tokyo. As she says in the book, it's about half an hour by bus from Shibuya, which she's very proud of. And they have an easy, middle-class life. We spend the novel in the presence and the mind of Natsume. We learn about her, we learn about her family, we learn about where she lives, and we learn about what's important to her. She kind of defines herself by her routines, by how she provides for her family, and also her physical space, her apartment, and its neighborhood. As I said, this is a very experimentally literary book. Paragraphs drag on for pages upon pages as Natsume loses herself in her thoughts and her experiences, and we get lost in the mix as well. There are long trains of thought that shift and morph as they go, just as real trains of thought do, but they also sort of blend into actual experiences and even conversations. And conversely, a conversation that Natsume might have with her husband or a neighbor will then morph into a train of thought as we move almost imperceptibly from a 2-person conversation into Natsume's thoughts and personal private opinions about whatever that conversation was, or the person who was talking, or something else entirely. This is the mind of a woman, what she thinks and does and how she spends her time. It's a book that examines the, on the surface, blandest and most uninteresting life and reduces it to its microcosm, to its minutiae, and shows that every single human life is exciting inside. Our private and internal thoughts, feelings, and opinions can be like an adventure, are in many ways an entire world contained within our minds and our lives and our experiences. But what's fascinating is, in spite of how intimate, almost sometimes uncomfortably intimate, we become with Natsume, there is a sense that we never really know her, that she keeps the reader, whom she doesn't know exists, at arm's length. It makes you wonder if she knows herself at all, if she is playing a role, because she seems almost deceptively happy and content with a pretty repetitive and bland life, while also proving that every single day in an ordinary life, however unremarkable, can be remarkable. It's a book that makes you wonder about adventure, about discovery, about things like sci-fi and fantasy that exist on grand scopes, because this is an exciting read that takes something so bland, like a human life, and reminds us that it's complicated. I will not be the first person to compare this to Lucy Ellmann's Duck's Noob Report. In fact, that comparison is actually made on the back of the book. But if you've read Duck's Noob Report, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about here. Except Duck's is like 1,200 pages long and a handful of sentences, and this is much, much more contained. You've got a handful of chapters, 150 pages, and just a lot of run-on sentences and paragraphs that are written absolutely beautifully. The prose in here is stunning, and to go back to Barton's translation, she nails it. She absolutely carries the weight of it. But I said at the beginning that this is a hefty book that you really have to focus on. Quite often we might look at a book that's only 150 pages and think, oh, I can read that in a day. And yeah, you can, but it's quite exhausting. Because of how daring the prose is in terms of its structure, it can really, really exhaust you. It takes so much focus and attention. And if you have ADHD like I do, and you find yourself occasionally drifting away, and you forget the point at which you started drifting, you'll drift back in, and you'll feel entirely lost, as Natsume is suddenly in an entirely different mood, a different place, doing a different activity. But because there's such a familiarity to it, because of the conversations that she has and the places she goes and the routines that she has, it all does feel familiar, and there is something kind of charming about drifting out of it and back in again. And there's also no real beginning and end. There's no narrative. There's no lore here. You are in the mind of a stranger for a little while. And that's pretty much it. You gather what you gather from her life, and you miss what you miss. The gaps will remain gaps. But there is a real weight and heft to it. The long, long paragraphs, the surprising beauty and complexity of the language. It is deceptive in how dense it is. But that kind of reflects how dense a life is, I guess. Depending on the kind of reader you are, it's going to be extremely frustrating or extremely rewarding. But this is very much a reflection of a life. At the beginning, when I started reading it, I was tempted to assume that it was going to be quite a feminist novel, about an unsatisfied housewife, about a woman feeling oppressed by the patriarchy. That's not really the case. It's subtler than that, while also being more general than that. It's a slippery book to define. It is a time in a life, and it teaches us just how complex the internal workings of every human being are, and that deserves respect. And it can even change the way that you see people. You know, on your day-to-day life, maybe you're commuting, maybe you're shopping, maybe you've gone out to a restaurant, and other strangers, people you don't know, people you'll never see again, make you angry or frustrated. They do things that confuse you and irritate you, and then you kind of label them as that asshole, that annoying person. This book kind of reminds you that people contain multitudes. Every person is a world, and that's gorgeous. Mild Vertigo is absolutely worth checking out, but based on what I've said, you already know whether you're going to enjoy this. It definitely won't be for everyone, but if you love literary fiction that takes a very, very simple concept, simple world, simple person, and extrapolates it into something beautiful and larger than you'd ever expect it to be, you'll love this. So check it out, and subscribe for books.